if you look at the AI startup industry, you know, the large majority of the things we're calling AI startups are white labeling an API for, GPT. So
Yeah.
they sign a contract with Microsoft, which, that OpenAI is sort of a part of Microsoft
Yeah.
for all intents and purposes, to use their compute infrastructure, their Azure
Yeah, for people who
cloud.
don't know that, the API is the brain that you're
Yeah.
kind of,
It's like the
yeah,
plug
the plug. Yeah, exactly.
the
Yeah,
socket you plug something
yeah.
into that then,
When it's created by
so
OpenAI or
yeah.
Microsoft or something. Yeah,
So like basically they are white labeling, like reskinning
yeah,
what OpenAI has created for a given market or what have you. But they're, barnacles on the hull
yeah,
of the big AI players ship.
yeah.
They are not independent actors sort of challenge, being kind of market challengers there. And that's an important distinction. So it's, this is why the push for massive government contracts, this is why the debt structuring is so weird because it's kind of circular because they haven't really found that killer consumer app. So it's, there's a question of like, where does break even come from for an industry where the capex is so exceptional,
Yeah.
and what we're doing is investing in a highly depreciable asset like these, servers and chips that themselves are sort of updated, you know every year or two, in ways that mean, we've seen data center build outs that are stopped mid build out. The plans are raised, the construction is torn down because they realize, oh, that architecture for the data center isn't gonna, it doesn't support the new H100s. It doesn't support the
Yeah.
new breed of chips. And we'll have to put in new cooling systems. We'll have to put in a new architecture for this building to do that. So let's just tear it down and build something else.
But how? I mean, you look at this stuff from a not a political perspective, but just from the administration's dealing with China and tariffs. And you read into these stories, and if you just have a sort of broad knowledge of this, you say, oh, there's a big negotiation about access to NVIDIA chips. And just in the sense that this is not, oh, this is interesting. There's the AI technology, and we kind of get it. It pervades almost every aspect of foreign policy, of domestic policy, in a way that in the first kind of, dot-com boom in the 90s, where all these junk companies are getting tons of venture money. And it's like, what does this all mean? I mean, that was a very separate thing. Whereas now the integration of all this stuff with governments and with policy, I'm only realizing this, and this is my job, in the past couple of years, of how important this stuff is in almost everything we do, as when it comes to governing and when it comes to foreign policy and tariffs and all this stuff. That's a big shift in a very short period of time.
It is. It is. I think you do have a legacy we're still living from the 90s,
Yeah.
in which the Clinton administration was one very clear about its motivations for privatizing network computation, for sort of creating the internet industry
In a sort of regulatory way. Yeah.
in a regulatory way,
Yeah.
right? And sort of economically, right? So
Yeah.
they were coming off the backs of stagflation. They needed, an economic miracle, privatizing the internet and sort of reaping the economic gains of turning that infrastructure, sort of, the pipes and the protocols and everything over to industry, was, meant to solve that economic hardship without redistribution, right? So there's a sort of tagline from that time, it's the New Deal without the socialism. And there was a very clear motivation within that sort of played out around the crypto wars and some of these other debates around technological standards and who should be able to deploy and access tech, basically to ensure that the U.S. was the center of the tech industry,
Yeah.
by exporting its networks, exporting its standard, exporting its sort of internet companies and their reach beyond the U.S., using soft power and other sort of mechanisms to do that. So there has been an understanding, that predates the internet, back to the telephone, back, to the post office, that communication networks are inherently centralizing. They're sort of natural monopolies, right?
Yeah, yeah.
You have to have one standard, they have to work together, and ultimately that's a sort of central node of control. I think we built it up, the internet, industry, with the U.S. as the center of gravity, China having, experienced this century of humiliation and kind of having a large enough internal market, was like, no way, you're not sort of getting a toehold here. So you have two poles geopolitically of, the internet industry, the platform industry, the infrastructure industry on which the entire AI industry is built. And that's the US with their hyperscalers, and then that's to a lesser degree China.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at what these same companies, these big tech companies provide, they're incredibly meaningful from a sort of soft power or even hard power geopolitical perspective. So you have the infrastructure that everything runs on, the servers, the clouds. And 3 US companies have about 70% of the global market. That's Amazon, Microsoft, and Google.
Yeah.
And then there's sort of China sort of competing.
And we see what happens when the Amazon cloud
Yeah.
goes down for
Right.
half a day.
I mean, you can liken that to an on-off switch.
Yeah.
Right? It's like,
I mean, it
boom.
was hard for me. I had things that I was trying to do that I couldn't do that day because the cloud went
And
down.
that's like the services, but that's
Yeah.
also our governments. That's our core
Yeah.
infrastructure. That's, a really staggeringly profound choke point,
Yeah.
single point of failure. Then you have, built on top of that is our information environments. So these are the platforms. This is, the social media, right?
Mm-hmm.
YouTube, Instagram, but also things like Google search, right? The, like what creates the shared reality
Yeah.
that we swim in. Obviously, since time immemorial, like states and those in power want to control that type of information. So these are,
Yeah.
these are assets. And then on top of that, I would characterize AI and these sort of like these large scale models and the APIs that are being licensed and the government contracts for use of AI as, effectively our decision making capabilities. So, you sign a big shiny contract with Google, you integrate Gemini into your sort of workflow at your corporation, but ultimately what you're doing is ceding decision making authority to a company that can change that algorithm at any point.